It was a cold autumn morning when Arthur, 85 years old, sat alone on the weathered bench in the small park, his cane resting against his leg, his eyes scanning the streets of the town he had called home all his life. Children laughed in the distance, their voices echoing through the crisp air. He smiled faintly, but deep inside there was an emptiness he had carried for decades. People in the market still whispered behind his back, calling him the lonely old man with no family. Some pitied him, others mocked him. Just last week at the grocery store, a woman he barely knew had leaned toward another customer and said loud enough for him to hear, "Poor man, to leave this world with no one to remember him. It's almost sad." Arthur had simply nodded to the cashier, paid for his bread, and walked out without a word. He never answered cruelty with cruelty. He'd learned long ago that dignity was his strongest shield. But that morning, something extraordinary was about to begin. Something that would rewrite the story everyone thought they knew about him. Have you ever been judged your whole life, only to discover that the truth about you is far greater than anyone could imagine? If you've ever been underestimated, humiliated, or dismissed, give this video a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear that life's biggest surprises often come when we least expect them. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt the world turn its back on you? Subscribe for more stories like this one, because today, what happened to Arthur will leave you speechless. Arthur lived quietly in the same modest house for over 60 years. Widowed young and childless, or so everyone believed, he had worked as a janitor at the local clinic for decades. The townspeople thought they knew everything about him, but Arthur had a past he rarely spoke of. In his 20s, during a time when he desperately needed money for his sick wife's treatment, he had been approached by a doctor with an unusual proposal to become a sperm donor for medical research and anonymous fertility programs. He signed the papers, collected the small payment, and never thought of it again. Life went on. His wife passed away, he kept working, and the years blurred into one another. But one morning, as he sat at his kitchen table sipping tea, a knock came at the door. A young woman with hazel eyes stood there, her hands trembling as she held a faded photograph. "Mr. Arthur, I think you're my father." He blinked, confused, until she explained that she had taken a DNA test and discovered dozens of half-siblings in the same region, all connected to one anonymous donor from the clinic Arthur had once worked in. At first, Arthur laughed softly, thinking it must be a mistake, but as she spoke, her voice trembling with both fear and excitement, he saw something in her smile, a reflection of his own mother's dimples. That afternoon, she returned with 2 more people who claimed the same connection. By the end of the week, a local journalist had knocked on his door, saying they had traced over 40 adults in town who shared Arthur's DNA. "This can't be real," Arthur whispered to himself as the story began to spread. Some people were overjoyed, some skeptical, others judgmental. But deep down, Arthur felt something he hadn't in decades. A sense of belonging he thought he had lost forever. The news traveled faster than Arthur could comprehend. Within days, curious faces appeared outside his small white house, some holding photos, others just wanting to see the man who might be their biological father. The market stalls buzzed with gossip. People who had once ignored him now spoke his name like he was a living legend. Yet, not everyone welcomed the revelation. At the town's only cafe, Richard Mallory, a wealthy businessman, known for his arrogance, slammed his coffee cup on the table when he overheard the conversation. "That old man? A father to half the town? Ridiculous. He's just trying to feel important before he dies." Arthur, sitting 2 tables away, heard every word. He didn't look up, didn't respond. Dignity was still his shield, but inside, a storm was brewing, not of anger, but of questions he had never dared to ask himself. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. Memories of his young wife, of those long nights when he had signed the donor papers out of desperation, came flooding back. He wondered who these people had grown to be, what lives they had lived, and if any of them had inherited his quiet resilience. 2 days later, a community meeting was arranged at the old town hall. Over 50 people showed up, some with nervous smiles, others with skeptical frowns. The young woman who had first knocked on his door, Emily, stood beside him and addressed the crowd. "We are not here to shame or glorify anyone. We are here because, whether by fate or science, we share a piece of this man's life." A murmur spread across the room. A tall man in his 40s stepped forward. "If this is true, then you're the reason I exist. That means something to me." Arthur felt his throat tighten. He had no speech prepared, no grand gesture, just the truth. "I never expected this. I thought I would leave this world quietly, without anyone to remember me. But now, maybe life had other plans." From the back, Richard scoffed, muttering about fabricated stories and small-town drama. Arthur didn't flinch. Life had taught him that those who mock the loudest often fear the quietest truths. Weeks passed, and the DNA results kept confirming what the town was still trying to digest. Arthur was connected to over 200 people, many of them living in the same county, some just streets away. For the first time in decades, his home was filled with visitors, laughter in the kitchen, stories over tea, and long walks with people who wanted to know everything about him. Emily became like a daughter, often helping him with groceries and bringing him letters from others who couldn't visit yet. But the more his circle grew, the more Richard seemed to bristle. At a charity event, Richard confronted him publicly. "So you're enjoying your little moment in the spotlight, huh? Making these people believe you're some kind of hero." Arthur looked at him calmly. "I never asked for the spotlight. I just opened the door when someone knocked." The crowd around them fell silent. Richard's smirk faltered, but he quickly turned away. The truth was, Richard's own wife had taken one of the DNA tests out of curiosity, and the results had shaken his pride to the core. Arthur didn't know it yet, but Richard had a secret he was desperate to keep buried. Meanwhile, Arthur's newfound connections began organizing family gatherings, filling his once lonely life with joy. For the first time in years, he found himself laughing until his cheeks hurt. One evening, sitting by the fireplace, Emily asked him, "Do you ever wish you'd known sooner?" Arthur stared into the flames. "Maybe. But maybe it had to happen now so I could truly appreciate it. Sometimes life waits until we're ready to receive the gift." She smiled, and for a moment, the decades of solitude felt like they had been preparing him for this exact season of his life. Winter crept into the town, covering the streets with a blanket of snow, but Arthur's house felt warmer than it had in decades. Every weekend, more of his newfound sons and daughters came by, bringing meals, photos, and stories of their lives. Some were teachers, some doctors, others mechanics or artists, yet all shared a strange familiarity in their mannerisms, little quirks Arthur recognized in himself. But whispers began circulating about Richard. People noticed he had become unusually tense at community events, especially when conversations drifted toward DNA matches. One afternoon, Emily rushed to Arthur's house, cheeks red from the cold and eyes wide. "Arthur, you need to know something. Richard's son took the test, and the results..." She paused, swallowing hard. "They say you're his biological father." Arthur froze, his teacup halfway to his lips. He had no desire to humiliate anyone, but the truth had a way of surfacing when least expected. That evening, Richard showed up at his doorstep, jaw tight, eyes full of both anger and fear. "Keep my family out of this circus," he growled. Arthur simply nodded. "I never sought to drag anyone into anything, but the truth, it has a life of its own." Richard left without another word, but his shadow lingered in the room long after the door closed. The following week, The local paper published an article celebrating Arthur as the father of our town, detailing how his decades-old donations had changed hundreds of lives. The feature included a photo of him surrounded by smiling adults of all ages. Arthur, though humbled, knew that fame was fleeting. What mattered were the quiet moments, Emily bringing him soup on snowy evenings, a young boy with his eyes calling him Grandpa for the first time. But Richard's pride couldn't withstand the growing rumors. At a town council meeting, he stood up and accused Arthur of exploiting the situation for attention. "He's just a janitor who happened to get lucky. Don't turn him into some saint." The room went silent. Arthur rose slowly, leaning on his cane. "I'm not a saint. I'm just a man who made a choice long ago to help strangers. I never expected anything in return. But maybe we should ask ourselves, why does the truth about where we come from scare some people so much?" His words lingered in the air like the last note of a song. Some heads turned toward Richard, whose face flushed deep red. Weeks later, a massive reunion was held at the community center. Nearly 300 people showed up, all connected by blood to the man who had once lived in complete solitude. Laughter and music filled the hall, and Arthur moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging stories. Then, as the evening wound down, Richard's wife approached him quietly. "Arthur, there's something you need to know." Her voice was soft, almost trembling. "It's not just my son. It's me. I'm your daughter too." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. The room seemed to fade for a moment as her words sank in. The man who had mocked him, belittled him, and tried to destroy his dignity was unknowingly connected to him by the deepest of bonds. Later, when Richard learned the truth, he didn't return to the community gatherings. His arrogance had crumbled into silence. Arthur, however, chose not to gloat. Instead, he reflected on the strange, poetic justice of it all. Sometimes, the loudest critics are standing closer to us than we ever imagined. And in that quiet realization, Arthur smiled. Life had given him a family bigger than he'd ever dreamed, and with it, a final lesson. The truth has no shame. It only waits for the right time to be seen. Spring arrived, and with it came a new rhythm to Arthur's life. Every morning, he would open his door to find letters slipped under the mat, messages from people who had just discovered they were part of his vast, unexpected family. Some came from other towns, even other states. He answered each one with care, sometimes inviting them for tea, other times sending a handwritten note with his small but precise handwriting. The town's perception of him had shifted completely. The man once ignored in the market was now greeted with warm smiles and hugs. Emily often teased, "You can't walk 10 steps without meeting a relative now." Yet despite the joy, Arthur carried a quiet awareness of Richard's absence. One Sunday afternoon, as the sun set over the hills, Arthur sat in the park where everything had begun. He was joined by Richard's wife, his daughter, who brought along her teenage son. The boy sat down shyly. "Mum says you're my grandfather. Is that true?" Arthur's eyes softened. "It is, son, and I'm proud of that." The boy smiled faintly, then looked at the pond, perhaps too young to fully grasp the weight of the moment. They spent the evening talking about life, choices, and the strange ways fate weaves people together. Richard never came to see Arthur, but Arthur had no bitterness left for him. He understood that some hearts need time, and some never open. That was not his burden to carry. On his 86th birthday, the entire community center was filled with hundreds of people, sons, daughters, grandchildren, and friends. Standing in front of them, Arthur spoke not of the unusual way they had all been connected, but of the value of dignity, kindness, and truth. "All my life, I thought I had no legacy, but the truth was out there, growing, breathing, living, and loving, even when I didn't know it." Life has a way of returning what you give, sometimes in ways you could never imagine. So live without cruelty, speak without malice, and give without expecting. Because one day, when the truth comes, it will be your name people speak with love. As applause filled the hall, Arthur looked at the faces before him, so many mirrors of himself, and felt a peace deeper than anything he had known. Sometimes the silence of the humiliated is louder than the shouts of the arrogant. And in that silence, Arthur had found his redemption.